Hello everyone, welcome back to another deck profile, me Chocobilly, where I am going to be looking at a wonderful little deck called Monstrosity. So as you can probably tell from the name, it is a monster-based deck in Water Lightning. It's an idea I've been playing around with for a while now, but something I've actually taken into my locals, and it did alright. It's a fun deck to run. It has its weaknesses for certain, but it's just a fun thing to have a go at. So I'll have a run through of all the cards I include in the deck, and then give my rationale behind them. So, in regards to the forwards, we have one copy of Twintania, 2 copies of Urianger, a copy of Lan, 2 copies of Rain, 2 copies of Tidus, 1 copy of Quattro Queen, or 2 copies of Realm, and 1 copy of Marsh. In summons, we have Bismarck, 2 copies, 2 copies of Famfrit, 2 copies of Exodus the Judge Cell, and 1 copy of Leviathan. And then we have 2 Ochus, 2 Oil Boils, 2 Thunder Drakes, 2 Blue Worms, 2 Atomos, 2 Spectral Keepers, 2 Tross, and finally 1 Twilight Odin. And then in the backups we have 2 Unit, 2 Nedging, 2 Sky Soldier, 2 Sanitas, 2 Kyrie or Kyrie, 2 Sage, 1 Lightning Sage, 2 Hilda, and 1 Philos. So as you can tell, there is obviously a massive emphasis on the monsters. So much to say that actually you have more monsters in the deck than you do forwards, with only 12 forwards in the deck. It's important to note that most of these monsters do actually become forwards as well, hence the low forward count. But yeah, I'll just run through the forwards, then the monsters and summons, then backups. So first up we have Twintania. So Twintania is a monster in all situations as well, which is really good because it means it is searchable through the likes of Realm straight onto the field. It is able to be played back onto the field with Quattro Queen, so if it's in your break zone because it died, because it is quite annoying, you can Quattro Queen to then bring it back onto the field. You can play it through Urianger, or it can be removed through the likes of Lan or Rain as well. But yeah, Twintania being able to deal 7k every active phase is quite irritating actually. So it's a really effective tool, or almost like lightning rod, for your opponent to want to get rid of this card as soon as possible, which allows you to then build other monsters and forwards as well. Obviously it does have the drawback to it being a monster as well, meaning that it is easier to be broken through other monster breakage effects, but still it's just as easy to recur through stuff like Quattro Queen or Sage, for example. Just be mindful of every time it goes dull, it gains a what's it called? A Giga Flare counter. But it's not every time it becomes active that it deals 7k, it's just in your active phase, it becomes active, you remove the counter. If you did remove a counter, then you get to deal 7k something. So if your opponent doesn't have a means of removing counters from Twintania as well, it means every time it becomes active it won't do anything. And similarly, if you do have 2 counters on Twintania, it won't deal either 2 lots of 7k, or it won't also deal 7k if you dull it and then reactivate it again. It is simply just at the main phase activation. Urianger, so yeah, be able to play Urianger onto the field to then play a monster. If you did play a monster, you then get to bounce one of your opponent's forwards as well. And I like that because actually it's does have a restriction on what monsters can be played. Again, we have 2 or less, so you can't play the Twilight Odin, that doesn't matter. But you can bounce any forward of any cost, so that's quite nice as well. So yeah, ultimately you can play Twintania, but there's some really fun things you can do as well. So Ochu, worth noting that I do have 2 wind monsters in the deck as well, so something a bit out of colour, but it's quite fun. So you can play Urianger onto the field to then play Ochu. Ochu then gets to reactivate 2 backups and you get to bounce something, not too bad. Oil Boil, draw a card, discard a card, always nice for consistency. Thunder Drake, you get to break a 2 cost as well as bouncing something, so it's potentially removal of 2 of your opponent's forwards. Blue Worm, again, just being able to draw yourself a card and bounce something. Atomos, so this is quite fun. You could have Atomos already on the field so that you maybe play something else. Maybe you played Atomos and then you play Urianger, you then get to activate 2 backups. If you're doing that alongside something like the Ochus, then you're getting to activate 4 backups potentially. Either way, just either playing Atomos with Urianger is good, or playing Urianger with Atomos on the field, also good. Spectral Keeper. Spectral Keeper doesn't, I mean, it's got no particular synergy with Urianger, but just having that extra push of being able to dull something out of the way is nice. Also, something I forgot to mention, sorry, Atomos and Ochu, Urianger is a nice way to be able to colour fix those guys onto the field as well. So obviously, outside of discarding either Ochu or Atomos to be able to play one of them, you are limited in the ways that you can play these onto the field, so OENJ is a nice way to be able to fix that. And then Spectral Keeper, yeah, just dulls things out, which is fine. Again, another way to be able to remove 2 of your opponent's forwards from blocking. And Tross. So this is the real party trick here, is that you play OENJ onto the field, you then get to play Tross into the field, at which point you then get to bounce your opponent's forwards, which will then trigger Tross's effect and then draw you a card, which is just a nice little consistency engine. Not too dissimilar from using something like Blue Worm or Oil, but Tross has a persistent effect. It can become a forward and then start bouncing more things as well. Right, next up we have land. Only one copy of land, so you can remove something, remove a monster from your break zone when you enter the field. If you do so, then every attack phase, both your opponent's and your own, you get to dull something out of the way. So that is actually really, really annoying for your opponent, because you're going to be having all these monsters on the field, which they are maybe struggling to break. Like I said, monster breakage is actually generally quite cheap, but many people don't run much of it. So they might be able to break 1 or 2 monsters here and there, but having just lots of monsters which aren't forwards yet means your opponent has to amass lots of forwards. Having something like land means that you can keep on dulling out 2 forwards every single time your turn comes around. Once on your opponent's turn, and then once on your turn. Rain, so I actually do prefer the haste giving ability in this regard. So being able to just play something like Tross onto the field at damage 3, then make it a forward, then give it haste with rain to then be able to attack with it, bounce something, draw a card. Being able to give lots of these forwards that have really good attack abilities is not essential, but very, very nice. So being able to use Atomos to activate your backups, or especially Tidus, being able to play Tidus on the field, then immediately give him haste, and then go through an attack, that means your opponent is then on the clock. So your opponent then has to weigh up the odds of, can they react to rain, giving Tidus haste, can they maybe Amaterasu it, or can they get rid of Tidus? And by that I mean basically him putting that back in, him putting himself back into the deck, and then putting your opponent's forward back into the deck, and then drawing yourself 3 cards. But yeah, rain, just being able to give something haste every single turn as well, means you can keep on playing loads of cheap monsters which can become forwards to then do lots of nasty things to your opponent's field. Next up we have Tidus. Like I said, just a win condition card ultimately, and that is something this deck needs. It's got lots of ways of being able to remove your opponent's forwards, or not remove them, but make them so that they can't block, either bouncing them or dulling them. But sometimes your opponent will have a forward there that you just can't get around. So having something like Tidus, where you can just keep on scooping under them and dealing them point damage, and not to mention he's got a nice protective ability on himself, and then draw you more cards as well. Quattro Queen, so only the 1 copy of Quattro Queen, because really the best card it synergizes with is Twintania, and there's only 1 copy of Twintania because I don't like running too many dark cards in my deck. So it means ultimately you can use Quattro Queen to get something like Ochu or Atomos, or there's any of your monsters back to your hand, which is nice, but being able to play Twintania back onto the field, because again it is an irritating forward, is quite nice. It's also worth noting that Quattro Queen is actually a monster in every situation as well, so you do have 2 forwards in this deck which are also technically monsters. Which is good though, because they combo nicely with Realm. So obviously you can play Realm onto the field, search yourself a 1 cost and a 2 cost monster, play them onto the field. But at the end of each of your turns, choose 1 for dependent controls. If you have 5 or more monsters, return it to its owner's hand. So that means stuff like Quattro Queen and Twintania count towards that as well. So you could potentially play, I don't know, Quattro Queen to then bring Twintania onto the field. You then play Realm to bring 2 monsters on the field. If you had a monster already on the field when this happened, that means you now have 5 monsters, and you can bounce something at the end of your turn. And Realm, being able to search just an Ochu or an Oil Boil, and then maybe something like Tross and Spectral Keeper is quite nice. Being able to use Realm's ability to get yourself to 5 monsters, and searching Tross into the field at the same point, means that you get to then at the end of the turn bounce something and then draw a card as well. Nice, more consistency. Now, I don't have too many 1 costs in this deck, just because in Lightning, Water, Wind, there aren't too many good 1 costs. I was tempted to use Adamant Voice as well, but realistically, because you have such a low forward count, you do want to have monsters that are also forwards. You could throw in some other things, like you've got the Propagator in Lightning, which does, I think it's minus 3000 power when it enters, but the problem with that is that this deck doesn't really have anything to be able to finish it off. There's no kind of chip damage or other power loss in this deck, so I was kind of hesitant to throw something like that in, even though it does become a forward. So just having something like Ochu, which reactivates your backups, or Oil Boil, which then gets you draw you cards as well, is nice. There's only 2 realms, but either way, be mindful of the fact that you might have already rinsed through all of your 1 costs already, because there's only 4 of those in the deck. But still, it's worth maybe shifting some cards around and just seeing what other 1-costs you might want to put in there if you do decide to change the deck up a bit. And then March, so just being able to search a character of 2 CP or less and play onto the field is really nice. Like I said, being able to search something like Atomos or Tross or maybe Thunderdrake to get rid of one of those annoying forwards, or just some backups. Now be mindful, March cannot search and play a dark character, so you can't bring Twintania onto the field. But still, you can bring a reasonable amount of backups and pretty much all of your monsters, which is really good. Be able to play Marsh onto the field to then bring maybe Ochu in. That reactivates 2. Then you play something else. If you've already got Tomos on the field, that then reactivates a further 2. So it's a nice way to be able to keep on reactivating or just having things a bit more consistent. Right, next I'll move on to the monsters. So nothing that I haven't already gone over yet, but Ochu, just a really, really nice consistent card. But really, it needs to be played off of Realm. If you're discarding another Ochu or Atomos from your hand to play Ochu onto the field, unless you've got a backup ability that you really want to be using, or you're just utilizing those backups to play more things, fair enough, but it's probably better to be played off of something like Realm or Oriange. Oil Boil, similar sort of thing, so it's just a bit more consistency. Draw, discard, it obviously isn't as good as just straight up draw like something like Blue Worm, but still it's a nice way to be able to get something into the break zone, which you then maybe want to use alongside something like Rain or Lan, and it could also be a way of you discarding your Twintania into the break zone to then play Quattro Queen to then bring Twintania onto the field as well, because obviously dark cards are traditionally quite hard to get out of your hand. But basically having a means of discarding something into the break zone, also potentially usable off of Hilda as well. If you're at 5 damage, you could maybe have played Oil Boil onto the field, draw, discard, you then play Hilda, you get to draw a card, and then you also get to bring something like, I don't know, Tidus or Rain or Oriange onto the field through that effect. Then Thunderdrake, there are a lot of powerful 2-costs in the game at the moment. You've got the Wonder Twins, Rydia, Braska. There's a lot of really, really good cards out there, and Thunderdrake just comes in, immediately breaks it. I just think it's a decent card. Now, obviously, it does have the fact that when it does become a forward, it will break at the end of that turn, but you've got enough forward monsters in the deck that shouldn't matter too much. And, you know, if your opponent then has to destroy it another way because you're blocking with it or something, that's probably still better value for you. Blue Worm, similar sort of thing, just draw a card, nice consistency, works with pretty much all the monster synergy in this deck, just a decent card in water, to be honest. Atomos, yeah, get to reactivate stuff, 2 backups on your second cast, and you also get to activate all your backups when you attack with Atomos as well. Obviously be mindful of the fact that Atomos might die when it attacks or just becomes a forward, but ultimately the best thing about it is the fact that it's not a forward until you make it one, which means it synergizes nicely with some of the cards later. But either way, just being able to reactivate things, especially in Lightning Water, which doesn't traditionally have much reactivation, is really, really useful to be able to reuse backup abilities or just cast more things onto the field. Spectral Keeper, traditionally not a fantastic card, but still being able to potentially give it haste and then go to attack phase, dull something out of the way, then attack with it, get to dull something else out of the way. Maybe if you've got Lan on the field, you get to dull another thing out of the way. Yeah, just being able to get you or shift your opponent's forwards out of the way to be able to deal points of damage is really nice, and this card has legitimately won me a game in the past just through its effect. So this deck has lots of ways of getting rid of your opponent's forwards whilst keeping them on the field. So unless your opponent has lots of annoying static or attack effects, it's actually a nice way just to be able to get through this. Tross, just a really, really good water card. You bounce something, you get to draw a card. When it attacks, you get to bounce something as well. But yeah, Tross obviously synergizes nicely with something like Oriange or Realm, but it's also got its own effect as well. You do also have Bismarck in this deck as well, which allows you to choose a monster, return to its owner's hand. So maybe you bounce one of your opponent's monsters as well. Now, Tross does state when a forward your opponent controls is returned to its owner's hand, you get to draw a card. So it would have to be a monster that was turned into a forward, so maybe your opponent has their own Tross or their own Atomos. Either way, be able to use Bismarck to then bounce it, gets to draw you a card as well. And then finally, Twilight Odin. Now, there is the only one copy of this card in the deck, and you do have to pay 1 lightning for it to become a forward as well, so it is effectively a 5 CP forward at that point. but if it does manage to deal a point of damage to your opponent, you then get to break a forward, and this is one of the only outright breaks in the deck at all. So I just wanted to include one copy of it, one just because I kind of like the card, but two, it is actually quite powerful if you are able to push through. Like I said, there are means in this deck of just being able to move your opponent's forwards out of the way without straight up breaking them. So maybe you just dull a couple of your opponent's forwards out using something like Spectral Keeper. You then use Twilight Odin, maybe you played it onto the field, make it a forward, and then you use Rain to be able to give it haste when you go to attack phase. It attacks, it gets to break something. Only one of them in the deck though, because it is a bit of a push to try and get it to work as it should. And next we move on to the summons. So next up we have Bismarck. So I do have the Una backup in the deck, so all the water summons will be reduced in cost by 1. And Bismarck becoming a 1 CP summon is really, really good. So you can choose one monster return to its owner's hand. You can use your own, but given the fact that you can choose one character you control return to its owner's hand as well, you don't need to worry so much about that, but it is still good to be able to bounce your opponent's stuff like a Tomos or whatever. And if they've got a Tomos on the field, they play one thing, or they cast one thing, you can respond by casting Bismarck. Unless your opponent has then a summon or back attack they can immediately cast, they're not getting those 2 backups back. Then Famfrit, the Duckling Cloud. So again, a really good removal piece to be able to only play it for 2 CP as well. But what's really good about this is that you only have 12 forwards in the deck, and even less unique forwards. There are 8 unique forwards in the deck. Obviously you've got a few monsters as well, but the key thing here is to be able to break your opponent's forwards without breaking your own, even though you're using stuff that is a bit scorched earth and breaking everything. So yeah, maybe you've got stuff like Tross or Spectral Keeper on the field, you cast Famfrit, they have to put their forward in the break zone, you don't have any forwards to put in the break zone because your monsters aren't forwards yet. Always a good one. Next up we have Exodus to Judge Sal, and actually the inspiration for this deck. So this is a really good card against certain archetypes. So for example, something like Soirees. Now obviously Soirees does have, or Morze does have, is it Morze? I can't remember her name now. Does have the effect of the Soirees can't be broken by something that doesn't deal damage or whatever. But provided you can get rid of her, then Exodus is going, you can just say, play Exodus onto the field, say 4, you get to break all the Soirees. Most of the Soirees anyway, sorry. But yeah, just really, really effective to be able to just break lots of forwards on the field. To be honest, as long as you're breaking 2 of your opponent's forwards, it's probably been worth it. Now, obviously, you need to be careful of not breaking some of your own forwards as well. You do have a fair few 3 costs on the field. You have a couple of 2 costs, and if you say 4, your opponent says 3, you break all of your 4s and all of your 3s as well. So be mindful of that. But again, you're going to have a lot of monsters that aren't forwards yet. So being able to cast Exodus and just say a number, and your opponent can say a number, but none of your monsters are forwards, not too bad. And then finally, just 1 copy of Leviathan, so being able to put something from your opponent's field on top of their deck and then hit them for a point of damage is really, really good. It might be a case your opponent's got a couple of forwards, one of them really annoying, you put it on top of your deck, you then attack with Tidus maybe, which can't be blocked, you then are guaranteeing that forward going into the damage pool. Leviathan also has the effect of, if you play with 3 elements, you get to draw a discarded card. The only way you're going to do that in this deck is if you discard an Ochu or an Atomos, and then pay lightning and water with your backups. Well, technically, you could discard a lightning card and a wind card and then pay water to overpay, but actually you can only do that if you haven't got Una down, because Una's reducing the cost to 3 anyway. So yeah, discarding with Ochu or Tomos is the only way you're going to get Leviathan's additional effect to draw discard. Funny thing you can also do with Tidus as well is if you cast Leviathan, you can put Tidus back into your own deck, which will trigger his effect and then make you draw 3 cards as well. If you put him on top of your deck, you can draw himself and then do additional cards. If you happen to pay 3 elements with Leviathan, you would draw discard, so you could draw Tidus to your hand, and then you could also draw 3 more cards. You know, it's just a weird way of doing it, but kind of funny. And then finally move on to the backups. Una, just being able to reduce the cost of your water summons is really nice. I don't have a huge amount of water summons in the deck, there's only 5 or so. But Bismarck being able to become a 1-cost summon is really, really nice. Similarly with Famfrit as well. Just all these annoying cards which will pose problems for your opponent. And just, yeah, being able to use Bismarck just for that 1 CP is really nice to be able to bounce some of your characters. Actually, I'm going to talk a bit more about Bismarck, actually, bouncing things. So, yeah. Being able to bounce something like Quattro Queen to then, so maybe you use Quattro Queen to bring in the Twintania. You then use Bismarck when Twintania dies again to bounce Quattro Queen, to then replay Quattro Queen, to then replay Twintania onto the field. It could be a case of replaying Thunder Drake to break something. Replaying Ochu to be able to get more backups, replaying Urianger to replay a monster to bounce something, replaying Realm to be able to bring more monsters on the field, replay something like Thanos to break all of the active forwards, replay Hilda to be able to bring stuff in, you know, anything with a decent entry ability, using Bismarck to bounce that card back to your hand and replay it might be what helps you win the game. Anyway, yeah, sorry, backups. Nedging. So again, a lot of smaller forwards in this deck, especially most of the monsters, which again are doubling up as your forwards as well. Things like Blue Worm, Thunder Drake, only 6Ks, so they are really, really small. So you do need to be careful of how you are utilizing these forwards. Given the fact that most of your monsters are really small, or most of your forwards are really small, what Twintania is an 8K, so actually above cost. Urianger a 7, Lan and Rain are your only ways of getting 9Ks on the field, and even then you have to use their removal ability. Tidus doesn't really matter so much about his power because he gets targeted, he moves himself, and you can also just go under your opponent's forwards. But yeah, not a huge amount of powerful forwards in this deck, so having something like Nedging to be able to boost the power of your smaller forwards is really, really useful, and can make something like Twintania become a 9K, or something like Lan or Rain become 10Ks, which is actually really, really good. Sky Soldier, so obviously your forwards are quite small, but that doesn't matter because if you are able to use something like Sky Soldier to make it so Thunder Drake, even though it's only a 6K, can block, it deals battle damage to your opponent's forward, you get to break that forward. Really, really powerful. If you can do it to something bigger like Rain, where your opponent was going to try and, maybe you're on 6 damage, and if you don't block, you're going to lose. Your opponent has to attack with a couple of forwards. Maybe they've got some weird effects on them. Using something like Sky Soldier to make sure that it is being broken, it's just a really good way of getting rid of that forward. Even though obviously technically dealing enough damage would break it anyway, there might be something that they can do. They might be able to reduce the damage that it's taking. Just making sure that it's dealing back battle damage to then kill that forward is always nice. Sonitas, so pay 2 lightning and colorless and dull. Put Sonitas into the break zone, choose 1 forward, break it. Sonitas deals you 1 point damage. I did originally have Luch in this deck because I didn't like the idea of taking damage, and your opponent drawing card feels kind of better because they're not going to rush you down as much. However, your opponent will take you to 2 points of damage and then no further until they can rush you from 2 to 7, because having things like Atomo, Spectral Keeper and Tross online is not something they want. Similarly for Ochu and Oil Boiler as well. So yeah, being able to deal yourself just that 1 point of damage, you get to break something as well is nice, but yeah, getting yourself to that 3 damage, then you can turn your monsters on and start attacking with those is quite important, to be honest. Next up we have Kyrie, just a really nice EX Burst card, 2 CP water backup, you get to look at your top 2 cards, shift them around, but ultimately you get to look at your opponent's hand, and you know, early game that's always really nice because you kind of get a bit of insight into what your opponent's going to be doing and basically adjust your game plan depending on that. Now, next up we have Sage, so just a little bit of consistency. It's a water backup that can set you a lightning card, or reveal your lightning card. Every time I use this card, I always seem to reveal Exodus, which isn't a bad thing by any means, but ultimately you probably do want more consistency if you are playing something like Sage. Just having a couple of these in there, giving yourself a nice lightning forward or lightning monster isn't too bad. It is earth and lightning as well, but there's no earth in the deck, but you could put earth into the deck if you wanted to. It could be playable off of something like Realm, so maybe you're running something like, I don't know, Hilgigas to break an action ability forward and cancel the ability as well. Either way, there are some cool things you can do with that card. And then Sage, so when Sage enters the field, choose 1 character card in your break zone and add it to your hand. So there's no limitation on the element of the character you're picking up, and it is character, so you can get your monsters back as well. You might want to switch these counts around, actually, maybe only have 1 Water Sage and 2 Lightning Sage. The one problem with that is that you don't want to fill up too many of your backups with recursion, and you want to save some room for things like Nedging and Yuna. Next up we have Hilda, so and again a decent EX Burst, draws you a card to hand, and damage 5, you get to play a forward across 3 less from your break zone onto the field. That is most of your forwards, to be fair. So you got Tidus, Rain, Lan, Urianger and Twintania. Being able to play Hilda to draw yourself a card and then play something like Urianger onto the field to then play a monster onto the field to then bounce on your opponent's forwards is a massive swing in your favour. Maybe Urianger gets to play a monster which you drew through Hilda, who knows. Ultimately, it's just a really good way to be able to kind of keep yourself alive or just really oppress your opponent's field. And finally, funny little Philos. So it's a card that I haven't really ever seen played at all, but another inspiration for this deck. So being able to play him onto the field, all active forwards become broken. So that means your forwards as well as your opponents. So the kind of idea behind this is that when you have lots of monsters that aren't forwards, your opponent doesn't want to attack with their forwards because of the fact that, one, if they put you 2-3 damage, your opponents get to start attacking as well. Your forwards your monsters get to start attacking as well. But also, let's say you've got something like Spectral Keeper on the field, just Spectral Keeper, and your opponent has 3 forwards. If they are at 6 points of damage, all it requires is them to attack with one of those forwards, and now Spectral Keeper can attack, or can just go to combat and attack and move 2 of those forwards out of the way as well. Maybe you've got Lan, you can now move 3 forwards out of the way. This deck does a good job of, even though your opponent having lots of forwards there, being able to just get them out of the way. That means they probably don't want to be attacking, so they have to amass their forwards. But when they do, you play something like Philos, they're all active, you then get to break all the active forwards. Again, most of your forwards will be monsters, or at least half of your monsters, half of your forwards will be monsters, which means that provided you're not at damage 3, so stuff like Ochu and Oil Boil won't die, you get to play Philos, break only a couple of your forwards potentially, and hopefully all of your opponent's forwards. Similarly, also Tidus can attack safely, so it means you can attack with him, he then becomes dull, play Philos onto the field, and then you get to break stuff. And Philos is another good reason to be running something like Bismarck. So maybe your opponent's like, I'm going to take you to 6 damage, and I'm going to make you break all your backups. Even though I break my forwards, it's still killing all your backups. They do that, they leave themselves without any attacking forwards, maybe, or any blocking forwards. You then cast Bismarck to put Philos back in your hand, and it's fine. You didn't lose any of your backups. Well, except for technically Philos. But yeah, either way, just being able to play Philos and break a couple of forwards at least is always really nice. And like I said before, the idea behind this deck is using kind of board sweep effects that are going to be hitting a lot of your opponent's forwards without hitting many of yours, because most of your forwards are monsters. And that about sums it up. Yeah, so just quick, I've changed the way I present these shows as well, because I was kind of editing it and doing it all myself. That just took way too long. So by doing this back on FFTCG, which is definitely a tool you should all utilize because it's really good, it's just an easier way for me to be able to do these shows, and ultimately I should be able to start pumping out one of these once a week as well now that I'll be doing it this way. But yeah, I'd really like to know what sorts of changes you guys will make to this deck as well, like what monsters would you throw into it, what maybe forwards would you do. You could actually put some more earth into this deck if you wanted to as well, maybe start utilizing things like Mira and Larkaikus, or just putting loads of earth monsters. I mean, you can put monsters of any element into this deck and it can be quite fun, using something like what's it called, there's an ice monster 2CP. When your opponent plays a character, they discard 2 cards, which is a disgusting card and not something your opponent would expect in a deck like this. So your opponent then discards 2 cards. That's kind of awful. You could put something like Biblos in here. When it attacks, you get to make your opponent discard a card. But yeah, it's just whatever way you think it would kind of fit into the deck. I mean, this deck is so versatile that you can kind of change it in whatever way you want to see fit. But yeah, let me know what you guys think and how you would change it. Just pop in the comments below. I'll also put a link in the description below as well to this deck if you want to check it out. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you in the next video.